Okay, a little bit different this time, right? I'm not sitting for a change, and since I'm generally a little bit, using my hands kind of stuff, you may see hands flying around a lot, but hey, don't worry about it. I'm actually in my basement tonight. You can see some of the posters I have up on the wall. I have the Grand Canyon back there, and I have one of my favorite running posters back there because, as you're all aware, I'm a distance runner, and then I have pictures of my family, my wife, my children, my grandkids, all that stuff over there, all that kind of stuff. But that's not what we're all about. I want to talk some more about poetry, but I want to make sure you understand that poetry isn't something that you should fight, okay? Don't fight it. Most of you did pretty well with your essays last week, but some people were obviously still fighting. And, I had to read it a bunch of times to understand. That's okay. It's okay to read it twice. I advised you to read it twice. Most of you got the idea. Don't read it the way that you always did before, line by line, but rather read it by the punctuation. Okay? It makes a whole lot more sense. But the other thing is this: a poem only means something if it means something to you, okay? So should you worry about what the author meant? Well, okay, that may guide you, but really, I'm more concerned about you looking for your own meaning in poems, okay? And so to help you on that path of looking for your meaning, I've picked out a pretty small number of poems. Some of them have to do with the senses, and my hope is that those that have to do with the senses will stir your senses and maybe remind you of things in your own life. And like one of them, Root Cellar, we get the concept of scent, and of course smell reminds us of many things. You've probably had it happen where you smell something and it's like, whoa, the last time I smelled that, I was, in such and such a place, okay? The poem Root Cellar may work in that direction for you. And the poem Green Chili may, stimulate your taste buds a little bit, okay? So, that a lot of times poems can stimulate the senses, and that's what we're looking to happen in those two poems. So write this down now. Write down the names and page numbers of those two poems now so I don't have to repeat them at the end of the tape. Root Cellar, R-O-O-T, Root Cellar. It's an old-time basement. Some of you probably, you may have them in your own houses, or your parents may have had them, or your grandparents may have had them, or you may have been in some old houses that had root cellars, places where people stored things that they grew in their garden where they stayed fresh for a long time. Okay, that's a root cellar. Root Cellar is on page 640 in your book, and Green Chili is on page 642 and 643. I think that it's easy for you to understand how a poem can stimulate your senses from those two poems, if you can somehow relate to them, okay? You may be somebody who's never eaten spicy food, so Green Chili may not relate to you at all. But most of us in today's world have eaten some spicy food, and so I think Green Chili will relate to us. Okay. The other thing that I wanted you to experience in poems is the idea that poems can be fun, poems can be funny, poems can be filled with satire, which is cutting humor with a point to it. Okay. And so I've actually picked out there's a section in your book, Poems, Humor, and Satire. It goes from 985 to 996. Again, pages 985 through 996. And in there, read through all of those poems. The first 3 or 4 are just like you'll be able to relate to them. I think most of you will have had some experiences that relate to them. But make sure that you read the one about when the Mexicans began jogging. That one's pretty funny too. Okay, they're all funny. Some of them are really overtly funny. Like if you've ever taken your dog, if you have a dog, obviously you take him out for a walk, and that one's pretty funny. But there's another one about a guy whose next door neighbor calls him because he's got a dog and somebody's dog did their duty in this neighbor's flower bed, and so that's pretty funny. And there's one that if you have a brother or sister that's like 2 or 3 years younger than you, or if you have a child and you've had a second child like 2 years later, there's one that the video is really funny and may well remind you of real things that went on in your life. There's a bunch of pretty interesting, humorous poems. Will they make you laugh out loud? No, I wouldn't say that. But you'll find humor. You'll find some maybe cutting humor, which is satire in these poems. And again, my purpose is to help you enjoy literature more, okay? And so for those of you who were a little bit afraid of poems, this is a real attempt to help you get beyond that. Now, a lot of you wrote about Richard Cory, and of course, that's a pretty touching poem, and it's not terribly difficult to relate to, the guy who has it all, and so it seems. But, life is not just appearances. And, of course, that kind of goes counter to our world today, where for so many people, appearances are what it's all about. Life isn't real. It's really only the appearance they can put up. And, of course, in Richard Cory, we saw that. I mean, that's a touching poem. And most of you did a really good job on that. A lot of you wrote about Emily's poem about the bird. And that was pretty neat, too. A few of you wrote about Casey at the Bat, and of course I love Casey at the Bat, which is why I memorized that poem and recited it to you from memory. But again, poetry is really kind of meant to be heard. It kind of invented with the idea that people would be able to memorize the story line by line. That's the reason for rhyme in poetry in the first place. Okay, so that people could memorize it. And from nursery rhymes that you learned as a little kid, they were easy to remember because line by line they rhymed. Okay, well, again, that's how poetry came about. So you'll find some poems where they don't completely rhyme, they don't rhyme at all. That's called open form poetry, and that's okay too. Poetry, obviously we have the printed word now, so you don't need to memorize everything. Okay. So again, keep in mind, that's how poetry started. People traveled from this town to this town to this town, telling their stories at gatherings, and the stories were written in poetry form, primarily so the person telling the story could remember it. Again, you can remember lyrics to songs because they rhyme, okay? That's what poetry is. Okay, so don't be afraid of it. Don't fight with it. Most of you did pretty well this week. I'm hoping you do even better in your essay because you'll be writing about the poems on those pages that I told you about. 640 for Root Cellar, 640 Truth through 643 for Green Chili, and then Humor and Satire poems 985 through 996. Read through them all. It's only 10 pages of poems and they read fast, okay? So read through all of those and then I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. But you already know, pick a couple of poems and delve into them. And boy, hopefully you can actually relate to some of them. You have kind of personal experiences. Your grandparents may have had a root cellar, and so boom, it may bring you home right away. Okay, but there's a bunch of funny things, or when your little brother was born and you were 2 years old, boy, you would have liked to have sent him back. So the video will ring that bell for you. That kind of thing. So these are a lot of fun. So, question for you to email me before you write your essay is this. Why did poetry come about? Okay, simple question. Already gave you the answer. That's what I'd like you to do. If you're behind on assignments, you got to catch up by Thanksgiving. I'll talk to you soon. Good work, folks.